In the year 1865, the boarding house stood just beyond the harbor road, its windows shuttered against the salt wind and its porch leaning like a tired old man. It was not the grandest house in town, nor the poorest, but it carried a scent that no wind could disperse. Ash. The smell clung to its timbers, to the curtains behind the panes, to the soil beneath its foundation. Men who walked past swore they tasted smoke on their tongues, though no chimney ever gave off more than the faintest curl. Children refused to play near its gate, saying that the air there seemed heavy, as if pressing down upon their lungs. Inside, travelers came and went, or rather, they arrived and did not leave again. The register book filled with names, but no one saw those same names cross the street or board the carriages that rattled past the inn. The town whispered, of course, but never asked. Maine had just survived the Civil War, and the people wished only for peace, not scandal. Better to leave silence where silence demanded itself. The woman who ran the house, Eliza Morrow, appeared a picture of calm rectitude. She wore her hair tied in modest coils, her dresses of dark wool trimmed only at the cuffs, and her voice was gentle, almost prayerful, as she welcomed weary travelers. She had been a nurse during the war, serving in the makeshift hospitals of Washington, where sawdust was scattered thick across floors to soak the endless blood of boys no older than 16. She had carried water, stitched flesh, and more often held men down while surgeons took their limbs. Her hands never trembled. The war ended, but its lessons did not leave her. She returned home to Maine carrying knowledge that was both sacred and profane, skills that could save life or turn the human body into an object of design. To her neighbors, she seemed pious, a woman who had done her duty, but behind her eyes there was another truth. She had watched life reduced to fragments of bone and sinew, had seen how pain could strip a man of voice, pride, and even his memory of himself. Where others saw horror, she saw method. Where others sought to forget, she found order. The boarding house became her theater. She invited travelers with a softness that disarmed suspicion, ushering them to rooms where the floors were polished and the beds neatly made. Each guest left their boots by the door as courtesy required. Eliza encouraged this ritual with a smile, promising to clean and mend the shoes while the weary guests slept. In the cellar, she placed them in neat rows, unlaced, waiting. Some said she treasured them as tokens of kindness. Others noticed that the shoes seemed to grow in number, yet never diminished. It began with small cruelties, quiet experiments upon the unwary. One peddler complained of a stomach ailment after supper. He vanished overnight, his bed unslept. No one searched for him until months later when his pack was found buried behind the well. Another man, a preacher bound for Bangor, was last seen on Eliza's porch. His voice had carried across the harbor the evening before, singing hymns. By morning, silence had swallowed his song. When neighbors asked, Eliza explained he had left early, walking north to catch a riverboat. They nodded and accepted her words, for her tone was steady and her eyes did not falter. Yet the house spoke its own language. Guests who lingered long enough swore they heard creaks in the walls at night, muffled sounds that could not be the wind. Some claimed to hear faint tapping as if someone were knocking from beneath the floorboards. One woman fled in terror after swearing she had seen soot drift from the ceiling while she lay in bed, falling onto her lips, choking her awake. Eliza worked with precision. She had learned in war that silence was a weapon, and so she padded one room in wool scraps, stitching the walls until they swallowed sound. Victims taken there were not killed swiftly. She would bind them upright in chairs, their mouths gagged with rags dipped in brine. Then, with the same patience she had once shown to surgeons, she used heated wires to trace lines into their flesh. Not random lines, but maps. She called them paths of the soul. Each victim carried their journeys written across their skin, she believed. And only through burning could the truth of those paths be revealed. When the skin blackened, she whispered prayers over the wounds, asking whether they felt lighter now, freed of the burden of unspoken sins. She did not always kill them at once. Some were kept for days, their bodies restrained and their diets reduced to water laced with ground bone ash. She believed this purified them, made them ready for release. The release was often slow. Veins opened and salted until the blood thickened, the heart clotted, and the silence became final. When she disposed of their bodies, she did so in ways that left no trace to the casual eye. Ash was her tool, burned bone ground into powder mixed with soil scattered in corners of the cellar. The smell lingered, forever part of the house. The cellar grew crowded not with corpses but with shoes. Eliza arranged them in pairs, soles touching, laces dangling like tongues. She considered them memorials. To remove the shoes from the house would be to free the memory of the person, and she did not want freedom. She wanted containment, order. The quiet collection of lives ended under her hand. When she descended into the cellar at night, she would stand among them, whispering to the rows as if addressing a congregation. She believed the shoes held voices, that the leather remembered footsteps, that the silence of the cellar was filled with all the words her guests would never speak again. The town noticed, but in whispers only. Why did so many travelers arrive at the boarding house, yet so few depart? Why did the air always smell of ash, even when no fire was lit? Some men speculated aloud, but their wives hushed them, fearing scandal or the ruin of trade. The war had left them weary. They wanted stability, not another storm. It was easier to look away, to believe Eliza's calm explanations, to let silence settle like dust. Yet silence has weight, and in that house it was heavy indeed. Shoes kept piling in the cellar, each pair a record of another life swallowed whole. The air clung with ash, seeping into the very beams, a smoke without fire. And the town, choosing blindness, allowed the boarding house to keep breathing, allowed Eliza Morrow to keep smiling, allowed evil to walk disguised as gentleness. The house endured, waiting for the next guest, waiting for the next pair of shoes to be placed upon the cellar floor. Eliza Morrow's hands were never idle. Even when they rested, knuckles lightly touching, fingers bent at the first joint, they looked prepared, not to strike, but to begin. They folded like those of a woman in worship, as if prayer were her native gesture. To the people of the town, she seemed modest and obedient to grace. She wore her grief like a veil, spoke only when spoken to, and smiled with such stillness that it left no shadow behind. But anyone who had ever seen her work in the war hospitals might have remembered those same hands, not folded but buried inside men's opened bodies, elbow deep in ruin. The field hospitals had not been places for the faint of heart. They were cathedrals of pain, where limbs were stacked like firewood and boys died while calling for mothers who would never come. Eliza had learned more than medicine there. She had learned timing. She had learned where to press, How long to tighten a tourniquet before the muscle shriveled like fruit left too long in sun? She had learned that life once opened obeyed simple rules, rules of anatomy, structure, order. But she had also learned what rules could be broken. In one hospital, a doctor once joked to her that the body was a puzzle box and that most of it could be unlatched if you had the right grip. Eliza remembered that. She remembered it for years. When she returned home, she brought none of the medals they tried to pin on her. She said her service was duty, not triumph. She asked for no thanks, no welcome parade. Instead, she reopened her childhood home as a boarding house and hung a single sign, "Quiet rooms available." Guests took it as a promise of peace. It was, in fact, a warning. She made no effort to advertise beyond the painted plank and a short letter left with the station master. Travelers came by the week, by the season, some with trunks, some with nothing but a satchel and sore feet. Eliza welcomed each with the same still posture, her hands always folded before her. She never hugged, never touched unless invited to, but once contact was made, once she helped a man with his coat or pressed a cup of tea into a woman's hands, something else stirred in her. The knowledge had not left her. She saw not a man or a woman but the structure beneath. The spine curving just so, the ribs rising beneath a blouse. The way breath moved too quickly when fear began its work. It was not lust. It was something colder. She had come to believe that the body itself held answers the mind could not reach. That by understanding suffering, its patterns, its boundaries, she could uncover a deeper form of truth. Pain, she believed, revealed structure, and structure revealed destiny. She began with the sick. An old woman with lung fever asked for a room, and Eliza gave it freely, tending to her needs with soft cloths and bitter tea. The woman coughed blood into the sheets. At night, Eliza sat beside her with a hand on her chest, not to comfort, but to time the rise and fall. She waited for the rhythm to falter, then leaned in and whispered that she would take care of the rest. By morning, the woman was gone. Buried quickly, her body signed off by the local physician as death by illness. No one thought to ask why the body had no fingernails. A merchant came next, well-dressed, weary, with a heart complaint he described in detail over supper. Eliza listened and nodded. That night she brought him a cup of water with a mild tonic. When he awoke, he found his legs numb and his chest unable to rise. She sat at the edge of the bed and pressed gently along his ribcage. He asked what was wrong. She answered softly, "You're almost free." His chest collapsed 30 minutes later, lungs drowned from within. He left behind a pair of finely polished shoes. She placed them next to the old woman's, soles touching, laces unknotted. But illness was not always the excuse. She began to take those who were simply alone, a farmhand between jobs, a widow traveling to visit her brother, a boy returning from the shipyards. They entered her house and found her gentle. She fed them soup. She asked nothing of them, and then when night fell, she chose the moment. She never rushed. She would walk the hallway barefoot, pausing outside each room to listen, not for noise, but for silence. It had to be perfect. If the silence was total, she entered. In one case, a man had fallen asleep with his arms behind his head. She slipped binding cloth beneath the mattress, looped it around his wrists, and slowly pulled until his elbows clicked inward. He woke, but too late. She had already inserted a curved bone blade into his jaw. He died making no sound, She opened his chest after death, not for pleasure, but for study. She labeled each rib with a pencil mark and noted their lengths in a journal that she kept hidden beneath a floorboard. The journal contained no names, only diagrams, sketches of opened bodies, arrows pointing to ligaments, margins filled with brief questions. Does pain persist if consciousness is suspended? Does truth reside in bone? Is breath necessary for memory? Eliza never screamed. She never raised her voice. She treated each death as a lesson, and each lesson demanded precision. Her hands moved, as they had in the hospitals. No trembling, no hesitation. She used straps not because she feared struggle, but because she hated mess. Wounds had to bleed cleanly. Cuts had to follow the curve of the body, not cross it. A single jagged line was to her an error. She corrected errors. Sometimes that meant starting again with someone new. To the town, she remained a quiet woman. She brought pies to funerals and sent flowers to widows. She never missed church, though she sat in the rear pew and never sang. Her hands were always folded, her head always bowed, and no one, not even the preacher, ever asked why her nails were always trimmed with such care, or why she sometimes winced at the scent of burning candles. The house did not creak at night. It breathed slowly, patiently, and Eliza Morrow stood within it, her hands folded, waiting for the next arrival. There was one room in the boarding house that no guest ever returned from. Its door looked like the others, plain wood, brass handle, a number etched in hand-carved serif, but behind it the air did not carry sound. The walls had been padded with layered wool, stitched with twine into thick folds. Eliza had sewn it herself piece by piece, each layer soaked first in lye to rid it of odor. It wasn't for comfort, it was for containment. When the door shut, the room swallowed every noise, every tremor, every human attempt to resist. Screams hit the padding like waves on dead sand. That was the point. Eliza believed that pain was only useful when no one could hear it. To her, silence wasn't absence. It was a condition, a control. She had not always believed that. In the war hospitals, pain had been loud and constant, men screaming into their own shirts, begging for water or death. But Eliza remembered a boy, maybe 15, who had suffered a compound leg fracture and refused to cry. He had bitten through his own tongue trying to stay quiet. She had watched the blood pool in his throat, the way his eyes went distant and glassy, as if his silence gave him power. That boy never made a sound until he died. Eliza never forgot him. She began to believe that silence was the final act of control, and control, once claimed, could be taken from others. That was what she now sought, not death, not even pain, but obedience, total surrender delivered through silence. One guest was a school teacher from New York, traveling south to visit his brother. Eliza chose him because he spoke too much at dinner. He bragged about his students, quoted authors she had no patience for, and laughed too loudly when no one else had spoken. That night she offered him her quiet room, saying it was farther from the road, a place to truly rest. He thanked her with a smile. She waited until he had bathed and laid down. Then she entered with the wire. It had been fashioned from piano string, coiled tight around an iron poker. She heated it in her small cellar furnace until it glowed a dull orange. The smell of the wool walls masked the faint hiss of heat as she carried it upstairs, wrapped in cloth like a sleeping baby. She bound him at the wrists and ankles before he could scream. the padded walls catching the first cry like a mother's hands. Then she unwrapped the wire and traced it along the skin of his torso, letting it sink in slowly, stopping when the flesh began to blister but before it charred. She worked in long lines, then spirals, then jagged breaks. To her, these were not burns, they were maps. She believed that pain revealed the soul's path, and the body would show where it had wandered. She whispered to him, not to comfort, but to explain. Every soul has a shape. Let me find yours. When he passed out, she splashed cold water over him and began again. By the 4th hour, he no longer screamed. By the 6th, his breath stuttered like a wind-up clock. When he died, she wept, not from guilt, but because he had gone silent too soon. She had not finished the map. Another guest, a boy no older than 20, was taken 2 weeks later. He had come from the shipyards, hands rough and face sunburned. He spoke little, which made him perfect. She prepared him differently. She wanted to test how blood could be shaped. She drew small incisions along the inside of his thighs, wrists, and under his jawline. Veins close to skin, pulsing like threads. Into each she inserted a thin reed soaked in salt. The salt burned its way upward, stiffening the blood as it traveled. She watched his eyes widen, his mouth open, but make no sound. It took 7 hours. He did not bleed to death. He clotted, every pulse slowing until his heart seized mid-beat. She called it a controlled departure. The salt-crusted reeds she kept in a jar labeled Preservation Trials 4. There was no rush to the work. Each experiment required time, calculation, care. Eliza kept notes in a series of black notebooks hidden beneath the floorboards in her room. Each page documented not just the methods, but the changes in behavior. How long the subject resisted when the screaming stopped, how quickly tears began. She believed that through enough observation she could categorize suffering into types. Those who surrendered early, those who broke slowly, and those who tried to hold silence and failed. The failures frustrated her. They meant she had not yet perfected the system. She began to use the quiet room more often, sometimes twice a week. She sterilized tools in boiling water, cleaned the wool with vinegar, replaced soiled sections with new patches from winter coats she bought at auction. The room was her temple, and silence its altar. She did not see herself as cruel. She saw herself as a student of human architecture. The bones and nerves were merely the instruments. Pain was the song. When guests asked about the room at the end of the hall, she smiled and said it was for storage. No one pushed. The townspeople had begun to notice the strange rhythm of her house. The guests who arrived, the quiet that followed, the never-ending line of shoes in her cellar. But no one dared speak directly. Those who had questioned her in the past had moved away. One, a constable, disappeared himself. Some claimed he had gone west. Others remembered the smell of ash was stronger that week. Eliza sat by candlelight most nights, reading her notes, planning the next experiment. She believed she was getting closer to something. Not an answer, but a system, a truth buried in the silence of a dying body. She imagined a future where pain was no longer punishment but language, a way to extract the deepest truths without a single word exchanged. Until then, she stitched her wool walls tighter, cleaned her blades with lye, and waited for the next soul to arrive. The boarding house never made noise, not from the guests, not from the floors, not even from the wind. Only the cellar breathed, only the silence grew. The cellar was the only part of the house that never changed. No matter the season, the boards beneath the floor remained cool to the touch, and the air hung with the faint scent of damp wool and smoke. The light from the oil lamp hardly reached the corners, yet Eliza Morrow knew every edge, every seam. There were no shelves for preserves, no boxes of coal or firewood. Instead, there were shoes, hundreds of them lined in perfect pairs, always unlaced, always placed toe to toe. No dust dared settle on them. She wiped them down weekly with vinegar and salt water, a mixture she claimed kept the memories sharp. Eliza did not believe in souls the way churches taught them. To her, the soul was not something held in the breath or the heart, but in movement, specifically the feet. The places we stepped, she reasoned, were imprinted into the soles of our shoes. Each pair was a living record of decision, hesitation, escape, return. A man could lie with words, but his shoes could not. They remembered the paths he had chosen, the pressure points of fear and weariness. And once he died, she believed those memories still hummed faintly in the leather, like vibrations caught in the bone of an old bell. When her victims died, she always returned to the cellar first. She would walk barefoot down the narrow steps, shoes in her hands, and place them gently beside the others. Each pair had a number now, burned into the tongue of the right shoe using a hot needle. Some numbers were low from her earliest work, others were recent. There was no difference in how she treated them. Every guest, regardless of status, earned a place on that cold stone floor. Some of the shoes had dried blood on the insoles. Others bore scuffs from a final struggle. None were cleaned. She preserved their imperfections as part of their honesty. Her journal included a second volume just for the shoes. Each pair photographed using a small box camera she had imported from Boston, each image labeled with time of death, method used, duration of silence, and whether the subject surrendered fully before the end. The shoes were not trophies. They were archives. When a guest fought her when their silence could not be coaxed or shaped, she treated them differently. She saw resistance as a fault in the spiritual structure, something broken that could not be reshaped by pain alone. For those, she used the wardrobes. There were two upstairs, both tall, both old, their doors warped and hinges rusted with time. To the casual eye, they were places for coats or linens, but Eliza had emptied them long ago. She had retrofitted them with hooks along the inner frame and small drainage holes bored through the floorboards beneath. A man from Ohio had been the first. He had arrived in the spring, cheerful, with a limp that told her his left femur had once fractured badly. He spoke kindly but asked too many questions. When he found her cellar unlocked one afternoon, he stepped inside, likely thinking to offer help with firewood. He saw the shoes. She found him staring. That night she drugged his tea. When he awoke, he was upright, arms spread and nailed to the inside of the wardrobe by thick iron spikes driven through the wrists. She had studied crucifixions, the Roman method. The trick was not to kill too quickly. She opened his ribcage with a chisel, one crack at a time. The sternum split with a sound she described in her notes as like dry bark snapping in frost. She then scooped out the lungs one by one and filled the hollow with coal ash. Not fresh, but aged ash, taken from hearths used to warm rooms where other victims had died. She believed it carried weight, a residue of memory. The man survived 4 hours after the final nail. She noted his heartbeat could be seen visibly pulsing in the ash until it slowed and finally stilled. Then she sealed the doors. He remained in the wardrobe for 3 months. When she opened it again, his skin had blackened and shriveled against the wood. The ash had fused with the blood that leaked during decomposition, forming a dark crust along the floorboards. She cleaned nothing. She simply cut the body loose and dragged it down to the swamp behind the chapel. She never buried them. The swamp erased everything. But the shoes, his shoes, she placed delicately in the cellar, the soles cracked from years of walking, the heels worn to a diagonal slope. This became the standard for the uncooperative. 2 more travelers met the same fate, one a mail courier, the other a printer's apprentice. Both found after questioning her habits or lingering too long in the wrong hallway. Their torsos were filled with different substances, chalk in one, crushed bones in the other. But always sealed in the wardrobe, always left to stiffen upright in death. Sometimes at night she would light a candle and descend into the cellar. She would sit among the shoes, legs folded beneath her, and speak softly into the dark. Not in prayer, but in remembrance. She would name the cities, written in the souls, Harrisburg, Richmond, Mobile. She would whisper facts she had learned from each guest, as if delivering eulogies no one else could offer. The cellar in her mind was sacred. It was not a place of horror, but of preservation. Outside the boarding house, the townspeople began to talk more openly. They noticed that the constable who had once questioned Eliza had never returned, that deliveries made to her house were never answered in person, that on foggy nights the windows of the cellar seemed to glow faintly, as if something beneath the earth still lived. Yet no one acted. They feared what they might find. They feared most of all that her quiet smile might turn toward them. And so the shoes remained, growing in number, lining the stone floor like the gravestones no one dared raise. Each pair a record, each sole a silence, each lace a memory unlaced by her own careful hand. The cellar never emptied, the stairs never creaked, and above it the house stood still, waiting. By the winter of 1866, the names began to matter more. Eliza Morrow had already shaped her craft in silence, refining her methods in the wool-lined room and the ash-dusted cellar. But the deaths had all been ordinary. Drifters, laborers, men with no one to follow their footprints. They were trials, rehearsals, and in her mind, incomplete. She believed that meaning required stature, that some truths were only revealed when pulled from bodies that mattered not only in flesh but in history. And when she read the newspaper one November morning, noting the passing through Maine of a man bearing the name Gideon V. Howard, a distant cousin of President Andrew Johnson, she folded the page quietly, set down her tea, and went to prepare the quiet room. Gideon arrived that evening just as the wind turned bitter. He was not an arrogant man, but he carried himself like someone who had always known his place at the table. His hands were soft for a traveler, his coat finely pressed. He mentioned in passing that he was traveling on behalf of a committee tied loosely to the post-war Freedmen's Bureau, though he offered no credentials. Eliza smiled at his mention of the president, murmured that he must be tired from the train, and offered him her finest room. She even added a sprig of rosemary to his dinner, a gesture of comfort but also of clarity. Rosemary, when boiled in broth, dulled the edge of fear. The dissection began on the second night. She waited for the sleeping draught to take effect, then moved him to the padded room. Unlike her previous experiments, she did not bind him with cloth or leather. She used surgical pins, sharp steel through the shoulders and thighs, securing him directly to the wooden slab she had modified from an old dining table. The work was slow. She had resolved that this time every inch of the body would be mapped, not burned or broken, but opened with care. The arteries were the focus. Eliza believed that blood vessels carried more than sustenance. They carried memory, guilt, intent. She wanted to see how guilt traveled through a man who had held influence, who had written laws, who had used his pen to shape the lives of strangers. She began at the feet and worked upward. The saphenous vein was teased free, pulled gently like a thread unraveling a garment. She dissected upward toward the femoral layer by layer, keeping the vessels intact, laying them along wax paper for observation. The blood was drained by then, collected in glass basins and poured into a long trench she had dug in the floor beneath the slab. Her journal entries that night were more detailed than ever. She wrote, "There is a whimper inside the vessels, not audible but felt. He carries sorrow in the legs, not the heart." When she reached the abdomen, she paused for rest, wrapping the exposed organs in linen soaked in cool lye to keep them from spoiling. Then she worked through the night, removing the stomach, the kidneys, the liver, each preserved in glass jars she had purchased under false names from a supplier in New York. She labeled each jar with a single word: guilt, treason, truth, conscience. The lungs she left in place, pressing her ear to the chest to listen for final air. When none remained, she unstitched the tongue and placed it into a separate jar labeled voice. 3 days later, the son of a Boston physician arrived. His name was Benjamin Locke, young, idealistic, loud with reformist rhetoric. He had written articles questioning the morality of war medicine, calling for new laws against the use of untested surgical practices on wounded soldiers. Eliza read one of his pamphlets the day he checked in. It was folded inside his coat pocket. She read it twice. He had challenged the same medical system that had once shaped her hands. He was not a man of action, only of ink. To Eliza, this made him more dangerous. She did not use the padded room. She used the wardrobe. He had spoken too many words at supper, too many thoughts half-formed and untested. She fed him powdered milk laced with a tincture of foxglove, which slowed his heartbeat until she could drag him upright. Nails through the wrists again, spine pressed to the back wall. This time she opened the abdomen from beneath, entering through the groin and following the iliac artery as it forked. She traced the blood backward as if reading his life in reverse. She found nothing of note. That was what she recorded: no resistance, no memory. His convictions did not imprint the body. She filled the cavity with shredded pages from his pamphlets, soaked in ash and urine, and sealed him shut. He died with his eyes open. Their shoes were placed together in the cellar. Gideon's boots were tall and scuffed from the Capitol stairs. Benjamin's were polished narrow, more for city walks than muddy roads. She did not number these. She named them. Beneath the sole of Gideon's left boot, she carved statesman. Under Benjamin's, she etched reformer. To the town, she offered soft lies. Gideon had departed for Portland ahead of schedule, she said, his business urgent. Benjamin had been picked up by a cousin en route to Boston. She showed the inn ledger, signed in their own hands. She showed notes they had supposedly left behind. The handwriting was hers, but shaky, just enough to look like another. She even mailed a letter under Gideon's name to a post office box in Nashville, addressed to no one. When it was returned unopened, she burned it. Weeks passed, then months. No inquiries came. Perhaps the men had been less important than she believed, or perhaps they had always been easy to erase. That was the thought that stayed with her, that even the names carved into history could vanish if the world allowed them to. And if those names could be taken, mapped, disassembled, and stored in jars, then perhaps the truth itself was nothing more than bone and flesh. She sat by the jars at night, watching the liquid cloud with time. She swore sometimes the organs twitched. She recorded her dreams, rooms filled with footsteps but no voices, letters being written by hands no longer attached to bodies. She began to believe that her victims were not dead, not truly. They had simply been quieted, not silenced, but suspended. The jars filled her cupboard, the shoes filled her cellar. The world above noticed nothing, and Eliza Morrow, calm as always, kept her hands folded, her house warm, and her experiments hidden behind the comfort of soft lies and proper names. In the months following the deaths of Gideon and Benjamin, something in Eliza Morrow's work shifted. The blood no longer spoke to her. The arteries she had once traced with reverence now felt too fluid, too imprecise. She began to believe that truth did not run through the veins. It stood upright in the spine. The column of bone that held the body was not simply structure. To her it was a string of prayers cast in marrow, each vertebra a word left unspoken. It was the axis of silence itself. She called it the ladder of surrender, and she meant to climb it one body at a time. It began with small alterations. She stopped laying her victims flat. Instead, she hung them, arms bound behind, torsos suspended over barrels salvaged from the war. Their weight bent them forward slowly at first, but with each hour the curvature deepened, pulled tighter by ropes wound through ceiling beams and pulleys she rigged from barn winches. She did not force the body to break all at once. That, she said, was crude. The goal was tension, the ache before the fracture. She believed the spine held secrets that would only emerge under pressure, not impact. The first to undergo her new method was a surveyor from Augusta, a man who had mapped railroads and whose back bore the signs of travel. Scoliosis slight enough to escape notice, but not her eye. She fed him sedatives, told him she wished to examine his posture for balance concerns. He laughed. By nightfall he was weeping into a barrel rim. She hoisted him higher every hour, watching his feet lift from the floor, the arch of his back pushing toward unnatural curves. When the first vertebra cracked, a sharp pop followed by a wet tremor, she exhaled with delight. She noted the moment precisely. 5th hour, 2nd pulley turn, she whispered, "You're beginning." She let the rest of the spine follow, one bone at a time. She massaged the space between each vertebra with heated oil mixed with crushed willow bark, to keep the muscles pliable, to keep the nerves singing. She wanted the body to feel the prayer. He survived longer than she expected, 12 hours before he passed out, 16 before he stopped breathing. She buried nothing. The spine was extracted whole, cleaned with vinegar, then boiled to strip the tissue. She strung the vertebrae together with copper wire through drilled holes, and hung the finished piece on her bedroom wall. To anyone else, it might have looked like a crude wind chime. To Eliza, it was scripture. The next victim, a male rider with a hunched shoulder from years of horseback, was suspended not over a barrel but against the cellar wall. This time she curved the body sideways, ropes tied at wrist, waist, and ankle, forcing the spine into a crescent. She did not let him die quickly. She used him to test what she called conscious curvature, breaking the back while keeping the mind alert. She whispered riddles to him between turns of the rope. "Do you know how many sins are held in your spine?" she asked. "Can you feel which one is snapping next?" When the lumbar gave way, he vomited blood. She held his head steady, comforting him like a mother. "It's leaving you now. You're almost clean." She did not keep every spine intact. Some she split into sections, slicing between discs with saws blunted just enough to resist. She found that vertebrae from the lower back were denser, more resistant to polish, but held fewer imperfections. Cervical bones, however, those from the neck, were delicate, almost childlike in shape. She referred to them in her notes as infant truths. They made for better display. One night she removed 5 neck bones from a former clerk, painted them with ash mixed into oil, and embedded them into the baseboard of her staircase. Another set she pushed into the support beams under the top landing just beneath the wallpaper, tucked where only she would know they waited. Guests continued to arrive, still unaware. They never noticed the subtle changes, how the stairs no longer creaked underfoot, how the banister had grown unnaturally firm. It was the spines. She believed the house should stand on truth, not timber. And truth came from the body she broke. Not all victims died in silence. One woman, a nurse traveling east to visit family, resisted. Eliza had admired her at first, even considered releasing her. But the woman's spine intrigued her. There was strength in the way she stood, something defiant. That defiance, Eliza believed, needed to be reshaped. She did not hang her. She bent her backward over a wooden arch rigged with iron clamps, pulling her stomach toward the sky. Every breath the woman took fought the curvature. Every prayer she whispered was met with another click of the ratchet. By morning, her rib cage had splintered. Eliza opened the torso through the shattered sternum, scooped out the lungs, and removed the spinal cord intact. She wrapped it in soaked linen and placed it beneath her pillow for 3 nights, hoping the dreams would tell her something. She claimed later that they did. Survivors were rare, but not non-existent. One boy, barely 20, had his spine bent so slowly that it did not break, but left him paralyzed from the waist down. She kept him alive in the cellar for a week, studying the twitch of his fingers, the wetness in his eyes. He begged to be killed, but Eliza insisted that your mind is louder when your body is still. She fed him broth laced with opium and wrote daily notes. Silence and stillness. Broken spine, clearer voice. When he finally stopped breathing, she did not mourn. She removed his spinal column and used the vertebrae as markers along the edges of her ledger, pressing them into the leather like studs. By now the house was filled with hidden bones, some in the walls, some in the floorboards, some worn as pendants beneath her dress. She no longer saw herself as a murderer. She was a transcriber. She believed that every life left behind a shape, and that her work was to reveal it. The town began to feel it, though they could not name it. They said the house leaned differently now, that the steps felt too firm underfoot, that the walls seemed warmer in winter even when the fire was out. Some swore they heard cracks beneath their shoes as they stepped onto the porch like joints shifting inside the boards. No one asked why. And Eliza, her hands as quiet as ever, continued her rituals, breaking backs, stringing bones, embedding truths into timber, until her house no longer stood on soil alone, but on the remnants of every spine she had freed. In the spring of 1867, a man arrived who did not fit Eliza Morrow's usual pattern. His name was Thomas Heller, a sailor from Portsmouth, lean from labor and browned by sea salt and sun. He did not smile easily, nor speak more than necessary. There was something closed about him, as if all of his softness had long since been washed away. He arrived at the boarding house just before sundown, boots caked in mud, a canvas bag slung over one shoulder, and a scar curling up from his collarbone like a hook embedded deep. He paid in full in coin and asked no questions. Eliza gave him room 3, the one farthest from the quiet room. For the first time in months, she hesitated. Something about him felt unsolvable. She watched him closely over the next 2 days. He did not wander the house. He did not speak of his past. He left early and returned late, smelling of brine and iron. She thought he might be a fisherman, but his hands bore calluses not from nets, but from rope, thick twisted burns on the palms, the kind left from ship rigging or restraints. And he watched her. Not openly, but closely enough to unsettle her. He noticed the way her eyes scanned the guests. He noticed that no one else had been seen leaving. He noticed the stairs were too quiet. On the 3rd night, Eliza prepared his tea with her usual tincture, belladonna crushed to a fine dust and folded into honey. But Thomas barely sipped. He stared into the cup, then set it aside. "Strange taste," he said flatly. "You always steep it this long?" She answered with a smile, but he did not return it. That night he locked his door. Eliza waited. At midnight she crept to his room, bare feet silent on the polished boards. She pressed her ear to the door. No sound. She turned the handle. Locked. She paused, surprised. None of the others had ever locked their doors. When she tried again with a key, the lock resisted. He had wedged something inside. The next morning Thomas left early. He returned with nothing but carried himself differently, lighter, as if he had made a decision. Eliza prepared no dinner that night. She simply waited. At dusk, he knocked on her kitchen door. "I'll be leaving tomorrow," he said. "Early." She nodded. He turned to leave, then paused. "Nice shoes you keep down there," he added, his voice even. "Neat little rows." Then he walked upstairs. She did not sleep. At 3 a.m. she unlocked the cellar and carried up the auger, a hand-crank device once used to drill into beams for joinery. She had cleaned and sharpened it after her last use, but never imagined she would need it again so soon. The hall was quiet. She opened his door slowly. He wasn't in the bed. Before she could retreat, a hand clamped around her wrist. In a breath, she was on the floor. Thomas loomed over her barefoot, eyes black in the dim light. He had seen the auger. He knew. And he was done pretending. The struggle was not loud. The house's walls, thick with wool and rot, swallowed every sound. He pinned her down with a sailor's precision, arm across her throat, knee to her chest. "How many?" he hissed. "How many did you drag down there?" She gasped, reaching for the auger, but he kicked it away. For a moment it seemed the spell had broken. that someone had finally seen her, that someone would bring the silence to light. But he didn't run. He stayed. And that was his mistake. They fought through the hall, down the stairs, into the parlor. He pinned her again near the fireplace. But she had hidden a nail puller in the kindling box just in case. She struck him once in the temple. He fell, not unconscious, but disoriented. She bound him then, wrist to ankle, a knot she had practiced many times in her notes. She dragged him into the root cellar by his feet, one thud at a time. There she did not use the quiet room. She did not pad the walls. She drilled directly into his skull. The auger entered through the right parietal, slow turns, cracking the bone until it gave way with a dull, wet pop. She poured seawater into the opening, one ladle at a time. She believed the ocean would cleanse his memory, would wash away the part of him that had defied her. He coughed, spasmed, gurgled. She inserted 3 eels through the hole, forcing their slick bodies past the shattered bone into the hollow of his skull. She believed they would eat what remained of his resistance. By dawn, his body was cooling. She carried it to the marsh behind the house, weighted the limbs with stones, and left him face down in the mud. The shoes she kept. A fine leather pair, laces frayed, soles softened by the salt. She wiped them down and placed them in the cellar, pair number 87. His body was found 2 days later by boys chasing frogs. The marsh had spat him back out. Word spread fast. The coroner found the hole in the skull, the bite marks from the eels. He said nothing at first, but others began to speak, quietly, carefully. The innkeeper's house, they said. The one that always smells like ash. A constable visited Eliza that evening. She smiled, calm, welcoming. She offered tea. He declined. He asked about Thomas Heller. She told him the sailor had left as he said he would. She even showed him a letter written in Thomas's hand, though the ink was slightly too neat. The constable held the paper, nodded, and left. Behind closed doors they muttered. Behind windows they watched. But no one came again. No one questioned why the boarding house no longer welcomed guests, yet no one ever saw it empty. No one demanded to see the cellar. The town feared scandal more than truth. They chose silence. And in the cellar the shoes sat, row after row, Thomas Heller's among them. The only pair to smell not of ash, but of salt. The night was thick with snow, the kind that muffled every hoofbeat and shutter slam, every human voice flattened beneath the hush of falling white. Winter had wrapped the town in silence, but from Eliza Morrow's house there came a sound no one could name. It was low like chanting, but not in words. It rose and dipped like a hymn with no language, no breath between notes. The neighbors who heard it that night would later swear it was not singing, but something else entirely. Some said it was 4 voices joined in pain. Others said it was the moaning of the house itself. But all agreed it began after midnight, and that it lasted too long. The next morning nothing stirred behind her curtains. Smoke did not rise from the chimney. Snow gathered undisturbed across the porch. The sound was never spoken of officially, but something had changed. What none of them knew was that Eliza had spent months preparing the choir. 4 bodies taken weeks apart, kept in a delicate state of decay. 2 male, 2 female, none older than 30. They had been chosen for their vocal cords, throats unscarred by smoking, tongues broad and clean. Eliza believed the human voice, when unchained from the brain, could be shaped into pure expression. If the soul truly spoke, then it must be possible to amplify it, combine it, force it into harmony. The body as instrument, that was her design. The operation began in her cellar beneath the rows of shoes where a second chamber had been carved into the earth. It had once been a coal storage pit, but she had lined the walls with waxed cloth and rigged bellows to the ceiling, pulled by rope through the floor above. Each victim had their jaw broken to widen the opening, the tongues stretched and stitched together at the tips, then braided side by side with sinew. She left them conscious during the sewing, not for cruelty but for calibration. Their screams had to match in pitch, had to bind with the right tension. If they thrashed too hard, the threads tore. 2 trials failed before she succeeded. Once the tongues were bound, she inserted reeds into the trachea of each, anchoring the airways open. Tubes were fed into their lungs, hand-pumped with bellows. She worked in rhythm. With every push, their chests rose as one. And with every exhale, the sound came, a single unified tone stretched from 4 mouths wide in frozen agony. It was not music, it was not human. It vibrated through the beams. Eliza Morrow's cruelty was never loud. It was ritual, patience, and surgical silence. She turned war's medicine into a private religion, mapping pain, stitching tongues, breaking spines in search of purity. Her victims vanished without screams, their shoes left in rows beneath her cellar. When her house finally collapsed under its own weight, the town sealed the records, rewrote the laws, and buried the name. But she remained in gestures, in the way guests now signed ledgers, in the fear of quiet voices, in the way a shoe left behind meant more than absence. She was erased, but her methods lived on, quietly in academia, in policy, in how we avoid looking too long at those who seem too gentle. Evil doesn't always burn. Sometimes it nurses, it speaks kindly, it promises care. Eliza taught us that horror doesn't shout, it whispers, it waits, it wears clean shoes. What do you think? Could a house like hers rise again behind smiling faces and the promise of care?